Welcome to the channel. I'm Cody Stoots. Let's talk some Texans and let's talk some trade. The trade deadline for the NFL right around the corner. Could the Houston Texans be moving assets for players? Should the Texans be involved in this trade market after the loss to the Carolina Panthers dropped them to 3-4 on the season? We'll talk about that in the video. Would appreciate a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Where's the strength of this trade deadline? Should the Texans be involved when it comes to improving their defense? Most of the players, it seems, that are available or rumored to be available here at the NFL's trade deadline this year are defensive linemen. So let's start the conversation there. When you think about who's available, who the Texans could go chase, how much they cost, it's defensive linemen. That's where we'll begin the conversation. We'll begin the conversation, the little game here. Play along as you watch this. Who's that trade target? All right, give you a second to get the guesses in. It's Brian Burns. Texans fans, you saw him on Sunday as he took care of business against the Texans, and Burns is an animal. I'm not even sure if he's totally actually available because the Panthers in the past, if you believe the rumor and innuendo, have rebuffed offers as impressive as 2 first-round picks for Burns. But no contract extension for Brian Burns from the Panthers. He's set to be a free agent at the end of the year, so it stands to reason that the Panthers could be trying to get something for Burns, move up the compensation that they know they're going to get instead of trying to tag him and trade him in the offseason. And you would think if they were comfortable paying him, they would have already just paid Brian Burns, and you wouldn't have to worry about trading him or what's his value on the market and things like that. The tough part about Burns is set to be a free agent, pass rusher, really good, so really expensive if you want to keep him around. And a guy like Burns, the Panthers don't care what you do with him. They care about what they get back. So they're going to be asking for quite a bit. I would think that a first-round pick is probably the starter to the conversation when it comes to Brian Burns. And for the Texans, I just don't see that being the level of investment that you want to go to. Now, if you got a first-round pick in the trade and you knew you were signing Burns to a contract extension, maybe that's a different conversation and a different story. But just giving up a first-round pick, not knowing if Burns is going to be on your team beyond the next 10 games of the season, I don't love that for the Houston Texans. I don't love that for really any team in the NFL. Then you start thinking about, okay, well, could it be compensation that's not a first-round pick? Well, why would the Panthers do that? Because they could tag Brian Burns in the offseason. They can trade him for 1 or 2 first-round picks in the offseason. That team can negotiate an extension with him in the offseason. And I got to imagine, I know it's only 1 win, but Carolina's probably feeling themselves a little bit. Do you want to upset the apple cart right off of a win by trading the best defensive player on the team? Now, that doesn't always play into consideration, but it's something to at least think about. I would think that Brian Burns probably off the table for the Houston Texans, though I would think some teams might be interested in the Carolina Panthers pass rusher. All right, you ready to play the game again? Here we go. Get your guesses ready. Who's that trade target? Who's that trade target? It's Danielle Hunter, the Vikings defensive end and pass rusher. Danielle Hunter, the next target, as we talk about here, defenders on this team. And Danielle Hunter's got a big fan around the NFL media circles. How about J.J. Watt? Before this week got started, coming to Danielle Hunter's defense, or really just basically saying, hey, this guy doesn't get enough credit. Going into this week, leading the NFL in sacks, leading the NFL in tackles for a loss. Hunter is a really, really good player. He's set to be a free agent in 2024. And the rest of his contract is kind of expensive. So that's something to factor in when we start talking about Danielle Hunter. So you would need the Vikings to help you out from a money standpoint if you're trading for him in most cases, because most teams have sort of allocated the majority of their salary cap space this season by now. So you might need the Vikings to help you out a little bit, which also increases the compensation in trying to go and get that guy. So would the Vikings be even willing to trade Danielle Hunter? So complicated question, because at 4-4, Actually, in the playoff picture right now are the Minnesota Vikings. Justin Jefferson coming back at some point this year. The Vikings feel like they shouldn't be sellers. But when they lose their starting quarterback, they have no quarterback of note to really think about when it comes to backing up Kirk Cousins, who's down with likely the Achilles injury, taking him out for the rest of the year. That's a rough spot to be in as a team. And then you start to think about what could 2024 look like for that team. Do you need to make a trade for a quarterback? Do you need to chase something like that if you're the Vikings? Or you kind of look around and say, yeah, all right, our quarterback's down. The NFC North is going to be tough to win, not impossible, but tough to win without Kirk Cousins. So we're going to go ahead and ship off our best defensive player, but he's still going to cost a premium because, again, the Vikings probably have to help the team out on the money side of things. So I would think that probably a second-round pick is where you start with Danielle Hunter. I mean, the production has been consistent over the course of his career. He was in the Comeback Player of the Year conversation recently after bouncing back after an injury a couple of seasons ago, and he's really good right now. The price has definitely gone up with his success in the past couple of weeks, but a second-round pick, I don't know that he can get all the way to a first-round pick. He just doesn't have, to me, that level of juice in the conversation. But would you trade a second-round pick and then some probably for Danielle Hunter? Because, you need the Vikings to help you out with the money standpoint. And I don't know if he's totally, absolutely a fit for the Texans. So that's a tougher conversation to have. And I don't even know if the Vikings are willing to trade this guy as they're right there in the playoff hunt, in the playoff picture with this team in the NFC. So, Danielle Hunter for a second. I'm going to go thumbs down on that. Brian Burns for a first. I'm going to go thumbs down on that. Get your guesses ready. Let's play the game one more time with the defensive lineman. Who's that trade target? This one, it's Chase Young, the defensive end for the Washington Commanders. Young is available, and Jay Glazer said on the Fox pregame show this week that one of three defensive linemen from the Washington Commanders will be traded. Three defensive linemen up for conversation: Montez Sweat, who's a defensive end, Chase Young, who's a defensive end, and Jonathan Allen, who's an interior defensive lineman. We'll focus on Chase Young because he's the only one that Glazer gave a explanation of what he might cost in a trade. Glazer said a 2+ or maybe a 3+ for Chase Young, who's in the final year of his career. Now, Young is been really good. Coming into this week, there's only one player in football with more pass rush wins than Chase Young. He's got a good pressure percentage, and the Commanders don't seem to be going anywhere. So they should be motivated to move some of these defensive linemen. But it's tough to see how they'd move both of their defensive ends in Sweat and Chase Young. And if they move Sweat, I would think that they're moving Sweat because they want to commit long-term to Chase Young. I'm not super interested in Montez Sweat or Jonathan Allen, just from the commitment standpoint. I'm more interested in the conversation around Chase Young. And if it is indeed a 3+, so let's say a 3rd and a 5th round pick, it's worth the conversation. It's worth having the conversation and seeing exactly how Chase Young might fit into the plans of the Houston Texans. But here's the biggest thing to remember with this Texans setup and chasing defensive linemen in this loaded defensive lineman trade deadline. The Texans really aren't struggling on the defensive line, especially after the Panthers game where they continued to get home on Bryce Young. And the end opposite, Will Anderson, Jonathan Grenard's having his best season as a pro. Grenard's in the middle of a career year. So if you're trading for a defensive end, who's coming off the field? Well, you're not taking Will Anderson off the field, and you're not taking Jonathan Grenard off the field as well as he's playing. And sure, this defensive end that you trade for could take some Jerry Hughes reps away or could take some Dylan Horton reps away, but that player pumped to come and show up to your team and try really hard when they're a backup player. So you're certainly not trading a first-round pick for Brian Burns to make him a backup. You're certainly not trading a second-round pick for Danielle Hunter to make him a backup, a rotational player, and even a third-rounder plus for Chase Young, making him a rotational player. It doesn't totally fit. The Texans, as far as the trade deadline when it comes to defensive linemen, they might be victims of their own success if they're thinking about making a deal, because Grenard has played well. Will Anderson's played well. And whose reps are you taking away? I'm not starting either one of those players just because I made a trade. I'm not putting the number 3 overall pick in the NFL draft into a rotation with another guy. And Jonathan Grenard's playing his ass off right now, so you can't bench him. So all these defensive linemen that we've talked about, any defensive lineman in the trade conversation, I'm going to say the Texans stay away. Stay away on the defensive line conversation for the Texans. Now, who could be available at some of these other positions on defense? I would think about a backup safety to help spell MJ Stewart. Eric Murray was a key part of this defense. They like to put him on the field in 3rd and long situations. Murray's hurt, so they don't have him. So maybe a backup safety behind Jimmy Ward and Jalen Petrie. And if the right cornerback became available to add to the strength of that cornerback room, I would think about that conversation if I was the Texans. Look, Shaq Griffin and Steven Nelson on the outside doing a fine job. Tavier Thomas had a couple of nice moments at the slot corner spot against the Carolina Panthers, had a couple of moments that he probably would want back. If you found the right cornerback just to help out, just to be a depth piece at that cornerback spot, and then it would really be a depth piece once Derek Stingley comes back. Griffin moves back down to sort of a rotational backup player, as well as whatever player you traded for from the cornerback standpoint. Maybe that's a conversation that you'd have if you were the Texans. And then linebacker, they seem to be pretty good with their linebacker rotation. Harris, To'o, Denzel Perryman, and Blake Cashman. So there's not a linebacker that it feels like would be available to go in there and dive in there right away in the middle of those 4 guys and take reps away from those players. And you got to remember, too, if you trade for somebody loses their spot. And it feels like the Texans like most of these defensive ends. It feels like the Texans like most of these defensive tackles and these corners. So secondary for a depth piece is where I'd primarily focus for the Texans. Not the most exciting potential trade deadline in improving the defense, but that's where the Texans are right now. They're in sort of a state of flux where you don't want to give up assets for an elite player, but you also don't want to have zero conversations if there's a depth piece that could be added. And it's tough to supplant players who played well over the past few weeks. Guys like Jonathan Grenard or Will Anderson or Shaq Griffin or these safeties. It's tough to supplant those players when they've played well with just a player that you bring in and would cost you something at the trade deadline and then has to learn how you operate and do things. I don't see a big-time trade materializing. I do see the potential for a depth trade on defense. So, again, not the most exciting trade deadline ever for the Texans, but that's where they are as a team right now. What do you think? Am I missing a player? Did I misevaluate the desire for a defensive end, a defensive lineman, another player out there on the market? Let me know in the comments section down below. The comments always active on these videos. And on your way down to the comment section, throw me a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And there'll be plenty more conversation about this Texans team here on the channel and on Houston football, where I do all my writing. The link is in the description down below. Appreciate you watching and can't wait until we talk Texans again soon.